Okay, so now that we've covered the Civil War, now we're going to look at what happened as a result of the Civil War and effects on the nation. So, Frederick Douglass said in 1882 that though slavery was abolished, the wrongs of my people were not ended. Though they were not slaves, they were not quite yet free. No man can be truly free whose liberty is dependent upon the thought, feeling, and action of others, and who has no means in his own hands for guarding, protecting, defending, and maintaining his liberty. So, this is a really powerful quote when Frederick Douglass is sitting here talking about how African Americans still are not respected by the country, even though slavery was technically abolished. So, African Americans are not technically free, even though the overall institution of slavery is gone. So there are a few different plans for Reconstruction going into Reconstruction. Now, the first one we're going to cover is Lincoln's. So Reconstruction means reconstructing the state governments in the South so that Unionists, people who are in favor of the Union, were in charge rather than secessionists or the Confederates. So he created the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction in 1863. It would establish a simple process for political reconstruction. There would be full presidential pardons for Confederates who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union and to the U.S. Constitution, and it accepted the emancipation of slaves. And then a state government was allowed to be reestablished and accepted as legitimate by the U.S. president as soon as at least 10% of the voters in that state took that loyalty oath. So 10%, that's not that bad. In practice, Lincoln's proclamation meant that each Southern state would be required to rewrite its state constitution in order to eliminate the existence of slavery. And his policy was designed to shorten the war and to give added weight to the Emancipation Proclamation. Then came the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which Congress passed, and it required 50% of the voters of a state to take a loyalty oath and permitted only non-Confederates to vote for a new state constitution. Well, that makes things a lot more difficult. So Lincoln refused to sign it and he pocket vetoed it after Congress adjourned, which means that the theory is you put it in your pocket and you forget about it. So he vetoed it without actually saying stamp on it, veto. Many Republicans in Congress objected to Lincoln's 10% plan, arguing that it would allow a supposedly reconstructed state government to fall under the domination of disloyal secessionists. So this is why that they created this plan. Lincoln didn't like it. So Lincoln created the Freedmen's Bureau with Congress in March of 1865. So it's the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And it acted as an early welfare agency to provide shelter, food, medical aid, anybody who was impacted negatively by the war. It established nearly 3,000 schools for freed blacks, including several colleges. And before federal funding stopped in 1870, they had taught about 200,000 African Americans how to read. On April 11th, 1865, Lincoln gave his last speech. He encouraged Northerners to accept Louisiana as a reconstructed state. So Louisiana had already drawn up a new constitution that abolished slavery in the state and provided for African American education. Lincoln stated, quote, "I myself prefer that if it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers," basically in regards to whether freedmen should be granted the right to vote or not. Well, we all know what happened to President Lincoln just a few short days after his last speech. Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, became president. So he was from Tennessee. He's the only senator from a Confederate state who remained loyal to the Union. Technically, by political party, he was a Southern Democrat, but Republicans picked him to be Lincoln's running mate in 1824 in order to get pro-Union Democrats to vote for the Republican Party. He was definitely a white supremacist, and we're going to see that in his Reconstruction plans. So in May of 1865, he created a plan that was similar to Lincoln's 10% plan. I mean, this is shortly after Lincoln died, so trying to keep everybody happy. Um, in addition to Lincoln's terms, which remember were about 10% of the population in the state had to take a loyalty oath, and then they had to denounce slavery, and then they could be states again. So he provided for the disenfranchisement of all former leaders and office holders of the Confederacy. So disenfranchisement means they're not allowed to vote anymore. He gave them more than $20,000 in taxable property to make them less angry. Johnson retained the power to grant individual pardons to anybody who was considered disloyal. It basically was an escape clause that Johnson was allowed to use to pardon anybody he felt like pardoning so that they could vote again. So many Confederate leaders were then back in political office by the fall of 1865. Can anybody see how this might be problematic in creating a new government? So Southern governments of 1865 looked a little like this. 8 months after Johnson took office, all 11 of the ex-Confederate states qualified under the Reconstruction Plan to become functioning parts of the Union again. None of the new constitutions extended voting rights to African Americans, and former leaders of the Confederacy had won seats in Congress. For example, the former Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, was elected U.S. Senator from Georgia, not even 6 months after the end of the Civil War. Do we see how this might lead to future problems? So basically, you've got a lot of things going on in the South following the Civil War. You have a whole new system of economy, where now you no longer have slave labor, but instead you have a contract labor system in which blacks worked cotton fields under white supervision for deferred wages, and it really was very little different from slavery. So these black codes were created in order to restrict the rights and movements of former slaves. They were laws. They prohibited blacks from either renting land or borrowing money to buy land. So where are they going to go? Essentially, this placed freedmen into a form of semi-bondage by forcing them as, quote, vagrants and apprentices to sign work contracts, which again was that contract labor system that I was talking about. It also prohibited blacks from testifying against whites in court. So if a black person said, hey, I'm being mistreated, or so-and-so did this and it's against the law, they can't testify against whites in court. So it essentially keeps the same system going as before. And appalled by reports of developments in the South, Republicans began to ask who really won this war, because it doesn't seem like much changed. So in early 1866, there was enough unhappiness with Johnson, which developed into an open rift when the Northern Republicans in Congress challenged the results of the elections in the South. They refused to seat Alexander Stephens, remember, former vice president of the Confederacy, and other duly elected representatives and senators from the ex-Confederate states. They were like, we gotta do something. So Johnson alienated even more Republicans in early 1866 when he vetoed a bill increasing the services and protection offered by the Freedmen's Bureau and a civil rights bill that nullified the black codes and granted full citizenship and equal rights to African Americans. Those vetoes marked the end of the first round of Reconstruction. During this round, President Lincoln and Johnson had restored the 11 ex-Confederate states to their former position in the Union. Ex-Confederates had returned to high offices, and Southern states began passing black codes. If you look at this chart, you can see how many vetoes President Johnson had in comparison to prior presidents. He had about 29. Actually, he had 29. Ulysses S. Grant obviously had way more, but it still is an extreme amount more than, say, Lincoln, Buchanan, Pierce, and Hayes. So by the spring of 1866, the angry response of many members of Congress to Johnson's policies led to the second round of Reconstruction. This one was dominated by Congress and featured policies that were much more harsh on Southern whites and more protective of freed African Americans. Now, Republicans had been divided into two different groups for a while. Moderates, who were mostly concerned with economic gains for the white middle class, and radicals, who were focused on civil rights for blacks. Most Republicans were moderates, but several became more radical in 1866, partly out of a fear that a reunified Democratic Party might again become dominant. And now the federal census counted every person equally. Remember, no three-fifths clause anymore, which meant that the South would have more representatives in Congress than before the war and more strength in the Electoral College in future presidential elections. So now there's a focus in the Senate and the House on Southern society. So leading radical Republican in the Senate, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and in the House, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, they were hoping to revolutionize Southern society through an extended period of military rule in which African Americans would be free to exercise their civil rights. They would be educated in schools operated by the federal government, and they would receive lands that had been confiscated from the planter class. Then came the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It pronounced all African Americans to be U.S. citizens. This was an attempt to provide a legal shield against the Southern states' black codes. It overrode some of Johnson's vetoes of both the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the first Civil Rights Act. Republicans were afraid that the law could be repealed if the Democrats ever won control of Congress, so they looked for a more permanent solution. This is when we get the 14th Amendment. In June of 1866, it was passed, and it was ratified in 1868. It declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were U.S. citizens, and it obligated the states with respect the rights of U.S. citizens and provide them with equal protection of the laws and due process of the law. For the first time, the Constitution required states as well as the federal government to uphold the rights of citizens. Other parts specifically applied to Congress's plan for Reconstruction. So it said that former Confederate political leaders from holding state or federal office. It got rid of the debts of the defeated governments of the Confederacy, and it punished a state if it kept any eligible person from voting by reducing that state's representation in Congress and the Electoral College. The amendment's key clauses about citizenship and rights produced mixed results in the 19th century courtrooms, but in the 1950s and later, the Supreme Court would make equal protection and due process the keystone of civil rights for minorities, women, children, disabled persons, and those accused of crimes. Next came the report of the Joint Committee in June of 1866. It's a joint committee of the House and Senate that recommended that reorganized former states of the Confederacy were not entitled to representation in Congress. They didn't think that anybody elected from the South should be able to take their seats, and they stated that Congress, not the president, had the authority to determine the conditions for allowing reconstructed states to rejoin. It officially rejected the presidential plan of Reconstruction, but it promised to substitute its own plan. In the election of 1866, Johnson attacked his opponents since he couldn't work with Congress. He appealed to the racial prejudices of whites, this is where we get into him being racist, by arguing that equal rights for blacks would result in an Africanized society. Republicans then counterattacked by accusing Johnson of being a drunkard and a traitor, which appealed to the anti-Southern prejudices by employing a campaign tactic known as waving the bloody shirt, which basically got people mad by reminding them of the hardships of war. The Republicans had an overwhelming victory. You have more than 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate being against Johnson. So Congress's Reconstruction Act placed the South under military occupation. There are 5 military districts, each under the control of the Union Army. You can see Virginia is one, North and South Carolina is another. Then you've got Georgia, Alabama, and Florida as one, Arkansas and Mississippi as another, and Texas and Louisiana as the 5th. So it increased the requirements for gaining readmission to the Union as well. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment and place guarantees in its state constitution for granting the right to vote to all adult males, regardless of their race. Then people got really mad at Andrew Johnson. So in 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. It may have been an unconstitutional violation of executive authority. It prohibited the president from removing a federal official or military commander without the approval of the Senate. Its purpose was political. Congress basically wanted to protect the radical Republicans in Johnson's cabinet. So what they did is they wanted to impeach him. So impeachment means you're indicted of a crime, finding someone guilty of a crime. Radical Republicans in Johnson's cabinet included the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was in charge of the military governments in the South. So Johnson believed the new law was unconstitutional, and he challenged the law by dismissing Stanton on his own authority. The House responded by impeaching Johnson. So they charged him with 11 high crimes and misdemeanors. He was the first president to be impeached, and 7 moderate Republicans joined the Democrats in voting against conviction because they thought it was a bad precedent to remove a president for political reasons. It occurred during an election year, so at the Democratic convention, they nominated Horatio Seymour to end the presidency of Johnson, regardless of impeachment. So after a 3-month trial in the Senate, they fell 1 vote short of the necessary 2/3 vote to fully remove the president from office, but he had been convicted of a crime. So in the election of 1868, the Republicans nominated the war hero Ulysses S. Grant. He had no political experience whatsoever, but despite his lack of experience, he won only 300,000 more popular votes than his Democratic opponent. Even the most moderate Republicans realized that the voting rights of freedmen needed federal protection if their party hoped to keep control of the White House in future elections. So this is where the 15th Amendment comes in. It was ratified in 1870, and it prohibited any state from denying or abridging a person's right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. AKA, this gives all men the right to vote. So then came the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed equal accommodations in public places, hotels, railroads, and theaters. It prohibited courts from excluding African Americans from juries, and it basically was poorly enforced because moderate and conservative Republicans felt frustrated trying to reform an unwilling South, and they were afraid of losing white votes in the North. And by 1877, Congress would abandon Reconstruction completely.